Hi everyone, thank you for coming to hear my presentation. I'm presenting my research on an issue relating to the regulation of computer games, specifically the regulation of a potentially harmful quasi-gambling randomized monetization mechanic in video games, popularly referred to as loot boxes. This game mechanic has been the subject of public controversy and regulatory scrutiny in the last 3 years due to its randomized nature and apparent similarity to gambling. Loot boxes are virtual consumable items in video games that can be redeemed or opened by players to obtain randomized rewards of varying in-game and real-world value. Some loot boxes must be purchased by the player by spending real-world money, for example, £1.99 for a loot box. Other loot boxes can be obtained for free, for example, by performing in-game actions, such as defeating an enemy or simply logging into the game and playing for a predetermined amount of time. Although I do recognize that even non-paid loot boxes are potentially harmful because they may normalize gambling behaviors, especially when children are exposed to them, my research focuses on paid loot boxes, which are more apparently harmful as they can lead directly to the overspending of money by players. Some games allow for player trading, such that loot box rewards can be transferred between different players. Players are not necessarily limited to trading an in-game item for an in-game item, which will not involve real-world money. Indeed, loot box rewards can gain real-world monetary value because players can arrange for a payment of real-world money in exchange for the transfer of an in-game item, rather than to trade another item back for it. Loot box rewards in other games, however, are restricted from being transferred between players and therefore cannot gain real-world value and have only in-game value. What can loot box rewards do? Some rewards are merely cosmetic. They may change the color of the player's sword from a mundane silver to a flashy neon green. Other rewards manipulate the game and the player experience more significantly, for example, by unlocking additional game content or by giving the player a competitive advantage over other players. Indeed, instead of making a silver sword neon green, loot box rewards can make the sword stronger, such that players who buy loot boxes can become stronger than other players only because they paid. It would not be surprising if competitive advantage may inspire players to buy more loot boxes more often than they would have if the rewards were only cosmetic. Next, I will provide some data on how popular loot boxes are with both game companies and players. Loot boxes are prevalent in all genres of video games on all platforms, including personal computers, consoles, and mobile phones. 56% of top-grossing mobile games and 36% of top-grossing desktop games implement loot boxes. 46% of video game players purchase loot boxes. Vulnerable groups, such as children, are also exposed to loot boxes. 93% of Android games containing loot boxes were deemed suitable for children aged 12 and above, and 57% were deemed suitable for children aged 7 and above. The UK Gambling Commission has found that 28% of 11 to 16-year-olds have reported that they have used in-game items to open loot boxes, and nearly 23% have paid money to open loot boxes. How much do people spend on loot boxes? We do not have conclusive data on loot box spending, either total or per individual player, because such data is held by game companies, and they do not release loot box sales data to the public to be scrutinized. Total global loot box spending has been estimated to be around £23 billion in 2018. This number is expected to rise to £38 billion in 2022. Approximately 20% of all surveyed players of a popular PC game were classified as problem gamblers. These players were documented to be individually spend on average £64 a month on the loot boxes of just this one game. Players may well be invested in and playing multiple games simultaneously, and therefore spending money buying loot boxes in multiple games. Therefore, actual monthly spending on loot boxes may be many more times than the findings of this particular study, if the player plays multiple games at the same time. Popular mainstream media has reported on a number of extreme cases of loot box spending. For example, the BBC reported in 2019 on a case where children spent nearly £550 on loot boxes without their parents' permission and still didn't get the item they were after. Another player discovered they had spent over 10,000 US dollars in just 2 years on the loot boxes of one single game by requesting his personal data from the game company using data protection legislation. This latter case also demonstrates that game companies have indeed collected and are in possession of data on individual players' loot box spending, and by extension, total loot box spending by all players on loot boxes in their games. The statistics cited demonstrate that the video game industry has a significant financial interest in loot boxes and may be incentivized to ensure their continued regulation. The regulation of loot boxes is a substantial issue that impacts many people across the world, including vulnerable groups such as children. Accordingly, the regulation of loot boxes may be justifiable to prevent potential gambling-related harms, and regardless of any contravention of gambling laws, to ensure consumer protection in general. The potential harms of loot boxes can be summarized as follows. Firstly, loot boxes are structurally similar to gambling. They both involve the player or the gambler paying an amount of money with the hope of attaining more money or something more valuable than they paid for through a randomized process. Basically, when described to a regular person, loot boxes just sound like gambling. Secondly, empirical evidence has consistently established that there is a relationship between loot boxes and problem gambling. Specifically, that the more severe the participants' problem gambling was, the more money they spent on loot boxes. The direction of this relationship is not yet known. We do not know if loot boxes cause people to become problem gamblers, or if people who are already problem gamblers are just particularly likely to be enticed into spending a lot of money on loot boxes. Thirdly, it is argued that loot boxes may abuse certain irrational decision-making biases and fallacies to cause players to spend more money than they had originally anticipated to spend. I must emphasize that what I have just discussed are potential harms. The harms of loot boxes have yet to be established by empirical evidence, which is necessary to justify the regulation of loot boxes. A comparison can be drawn between the regulation of loot boxes and the regulation of violent video game content. Arguably, moral panic caused violent video game content to be restricted. Empirical evidence has since demonstrated that violent video game content does not lead to more violent behavior in children. Similarly, it may be established that loot boxes are not particularly harmful. If so, then loot boxes should not be regulated. With that said, I note that empirical evidence on the harms of loot boxes has not been forthcoming, at least partially because the video game industry has not shared player loot box spending data with independent researchers to assist them. Researchers thus far have been largely relying on self-reported survey data from players, which is prone to bias and may not be reliable. Many have called on the industry to work proactively with researchers, and I would echo that here. A basis for regulating loot boxes now, despite the lack of evidence, based on the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle can be summarized as, because loot boxes are potentially very harmful, especially to children, just to be safe, despite a lack of evidence, preemptively regulating loot boxes is justified, until it is proven that loot boxes are unlikely to harm. Indeed, the Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Committee of the House of Commons has recommended that loot boxes be regulated now based on the precautionary principle. The committee argued that the burden of proof should now be on the video game industry to prove that loot boxes are not harmful, rather than for researchers and regulators to prove that they are. One of the most obvious approaches to regulating loot boxes is to regulate them as gambling. The gambling regulators of many jurisdictions have examined whether or not loot boxes constitute gambling under existing national gambling law. The problem with this approach is that there are differences in how each jurisdiction defines gambling. As applied to loot boxes, this means that certain implementations constitute gambling in certain jurisdictions, but not in others. For example, most jurisdictions, including the UK, determine that only loot boxes that both cost real-world money to buy and provide rewards that are worth real-world money constitute gambling. In contrast, Belgium's gambling regulator determined that all loot boxes that cost real-world money to buy constitute gambling, regardless of whether or not the rewards are worth real-world money. What this means is that loot boxes that cost real-world money to buy, but whose rewards are restricted from being traded between players, nonetheless constitute gambling in Belgium. However, they constitute gambling only in Belgium and not in the UK. Empirical research has shown that whether or not the rewards of loot boxes are worth real-world money does not appear to be a unique motivator for players to purchase loot boxes. Therefore, both types of paid loot boxes are likely equally potentially harmful. However, only consumers in Belgium are protected from both types. Consumers in other jurisdictions, such as the UK, only receive more limited protection. Consumer protection is therefore not universal and not as good as it could be in all jurisdictions. A second problem with regulating loot boxes as gambling is that certain gambling regulators, including the UK's, have proven to be unwilling to enforce the law against loot boxes, even though they contravene gambling law. For example, the UK, France, and the Netherlands, like most other jurisdictions, have all determined that loot boxes that both cost real-world money to buy and provide rewards that are worth real-world money constitute gambling. However, the UK's and France's gambling regulators have not enforced gambling law against games in which converting loot box rewards into cash is possible, but is technically not permitted by the game company according to their terms of service. Basically, unless the game is explicitly allowing players to turn their in-game rewards into real-world money, neither the UK nor the French regulators are willing to enforce the law as drafted. In contrast, the Dutch regulator did enforce gambling law against these games. These games have complied with the Dutch regulator's opinion and changed the way their loot boxes are implemented. Despite coming to the same regulatory conclusion on whether or not certain loot boxes constitute gambling, the regulators' divergent enforcement actions have again caused consumers in certain jurisdictions to be less protected than those in other countries. The third problem with the regulator's gambling approach is that loot boxes may become over-regulated. Belgium's ban of all paid loot boxes has caused certain games from leading game companies to be withdrawn from the market, because operating them in the country is no longer commercially viable. This is harmful in two ways. Firstly, consumers are deprived of the opportunity to play certain games. Secondly, the video games industry's creative output and economic potential are unduly restricted. In the UK, the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee of the House of Commons and the Gambling Industry Committee of the House of Lords have both recommended that all paid loot boxes are regulated as gambling. The Gambling Industry Committee even recommended that loot boxes should be regulated immediately by executive regulation. If an implementation of loot boxes constitutes gambling under existing law, then it should be regulated as gambling in that jurisdiction. However, I am of the view that gambling law should not be amended or extended to include paid loot boxes that offer rewards that are not worth real-world money, which is the position taken by the two UK committees. I disagree with that position to ban all paid loot boxes outright as gambling, because I believe that certain loot box implementations are defensible. Imagine, at the moment, a player may need to spend a lot of money in order to get rare reward, because getting it is never guaranteed. What if instead the loot box is implemented such that once a certain reasonable, predetermined amount of money has been spent on the mechanic, the player is guaranteed to be given the rare reward? If the player can only spend at most £30 on the loot box, then they simply cannot overspend. The player is still given the opportunity to try to win the desired rare reward for less than £30, but they can be confident that they are guaranteed to eventually obtain the rare reward for a reasonable amount of money, even in the worst case scenario. I believe changing how loot boxes are implemented can potentially reduce and even prevent overspending. I will now turn to critique some consumer protection measures that can be implemented. One consumer protection approach is to require game companies to disclose the probabilities of obtaining potential rewards. For example, in the image on the right, you can see how this game has disclosed that the probabilities of obtaining Mario is 1%, as annotated by the red circle, and how the probabilities of obtaining Pauline is 0.25%, as annotated by the green circle. Such disclosures are likely able to better inform consumers as to their chances of winning. And for this reason, Such probability disclosures are legally required for certain gambling activities in the UK and in many other jurisdictions. So there is precedent. The video game industry is generally accepting of implementing this in their games. The People's Republic of China has required loot boxes to disclose probabilities since 2017. However, China's law recognizes the disclosure either on the game's official website or in-game on the loot box purchase page as compliant. Many players will never visit the official website, and therefore a disclosure in-game is likely to be more effective. However, because Chinese law allows for discretion on this point, game companies can reasonably be expected to comply with the method that is least effective to ensure commercial gain. Research in other fields, such as alcohol content and gambling probabilities disclosures, have shown that companies tend to comply in suboptimal ways, arguably to ensure commercial success. What this means is that the method of disclosure must be standardized to ensure effectiveness and prevent unscrupulous game companies from disclosing probabilities using ineffective methods. It is also necessary for there to be some sort of enforcement regime for companies who are failing to comply. Voluntary industry self-regulation in South Korea has admirably standardized and enforced loot box probability disclosures. However, the South Korean self-regulation has no teeth. All we can do to punish companies is to name and shame them for failing to comply with industry standards. This has proven ineffective against the leading game companies. Probability disclosure requirements will be much more effective if they are imposed as law, such that game companies that have failed to comply could be fined or prevented from operating their games. Another consumer protection approach to regulating loot boxes is imposing a maximum spending limit. This is very effectively going to prevent players from overspending. They simply cannot overspend, even if they want to, after reaching the mandated limit. Similar measures have been imposed in gambling contexts with some success. Many casinos allow players to voluntarily set a limit, and countries such as Norway compulsorily impose such a limit. There are two problems with this approach. Firstly, it is hard to determine what is the appropriate limit for each individual player. Each player's own financial circumstances could differ significantly. Spending £50 a month on a game may be quite reasonable for many people, but it could constitute overspending for others. The People's Republic of China has imposed maximum spending limits on video games in general on children. Their approach is to vary the limit according to the age of the child. The older they are, the more money they are allowed to spend. This seems like a reasonable approach. It is notable that even the Chinese government deemed it too paternalistic to impose such a limit compulsorily on adults. A second issue with maximum spending limits is enforcement. If the limit is imposed against each user account, the player can just make multiple accounts and exceed the limit. China was able to impose maximum spending limits because every citizen has a unique identification number. China requires that all video game user accounts are linked to an ID number. Therefore, the Chinese government can know who each video game user account belongs to and is able to trace each person's spending across multiple accounts and across multiple games. This cannot be done in many other countries, including the UK, because of a lack of a compulsory national identification regime. It is my view that game companies are in a better position to implement and enforce spending limits. They can design the loot box mechanic such that once a certain amount of money is spent, all rewards are guaranteed to be given, thus effectively imposing a maximum spending limit through game design without the need for further enforcement actions. A few other ethical game design measures to consider include ensuring the loot box rewards do not provide the player with a competitive advantage and unfairly induce players to purchase them in order to win more games. Not offering loot boxes that contain rewards that are only available for a limited amount of time, such that the player is pressured to make a decision to purchase within a very limited amount of time. Thirdly, we can ensure that loot box rewards can realistically be obtained through methods other than randomized purchase. For example, by allowing players to get them after defeating certain enemies, and for example, by allowing the players to purchase the rewards directly without any randomization involved. In conclusion, I believe the regulation of loot boxes should be approached from a combined legal and self-regulatory perspective. Legal regulation on its own may not be able to adapt quick enough to technological developments and may overregulate. Voluntary self-regulation on its own has not proven to be trustworthy. Self-regulation is not going to be subscribed to by every game company, and self-regulation also lacks teeth to ensure uncooperative companies are punished. In my view, the law should set out minimal acceptable standards of consumer protection and provide enforcement powers to ensure a basic, sufficient degree of consumer protection. The video game industry knows about the intricacies of game design better, which is why industry self-regulation should complement the legal regime and thrive to surpass this minimal standard and provide an even higher standard of consumer protection. What this means in relation to probabilities disclosures is for the law to require disclosure in a basic standardized way and for the law to provide enforcement options against companies who do not disclose. The industry is then expected to self-regulate beyond this legal standard by implementing additional, more prominent and effective ways for players to access probability disclosures in order to better inform consumers. The government should also promote and incentivize ethical game design by considering it as a criterion for existing discretionary grants and tax relief. The UK government already promotes the video game industry with grants and tax relief based on a cultural factor. It would not be unreasonable for ethical game design to be considered as a criterion in this assessment. A further approach would be a certification regime that shows whether or not the game has been ethically designed, similar to organic food or sustainable fishing certifications. Players should also be made aware of ethical game design and encouraged only to play and pay for ethically designed video games. I am happy to take any questions in the live question and answer session. Thank you very much.